Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a totally fascinating evolutionary journey to understand how global powerhouses actually measure a successful economy. For decades, we've basically been programmed to just look at the dollar signs, right? We just assume more money automatically equals more success. But as you're going to see today, if we look just a bit beyond those basic numbers, we uncover a reality that's way more complex and, honestly, a whole lot more human.
It's kind of a provocative thought, isn't it? Like, if a country is raking in billions, does that actually mean its people are living good lives? Well, before a giant multinational, think IKEA, for example, expands into a brand new market, they ask themselves this exact question. When IKEA looked at India, they didn't just see a lower average income compared to developed nations. No, they looked at economic growth, population size, and future consumer demand. They really want to evaluate the true long-term potential of a place, rather than just taking surface-level wealth at face value. Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the traditional wealth check, then we'll look beyond the surface numbers, explore the rise of green economics, dive into measuring happiness and well-being, and finally wrap things up with the investor's final checklist. All right, part one, the traditional wealth check. We've got to start with those foundational monetary indicators just to establish our baseline. So the first big metric to wrap our heads around is gross national income, or GNI. Simply put, this measures the total income earned by a country's residents and businesses, absolutely regardless of where in the world that money is actually generated. To put that into perspective, think about the money sent home by overseas workers in the Philippines. Those remittances count directly toward the Philippines' GNI. Or take the profits from the Malaysian company Petronas operating oil fields way out in Iraq or Canada. All of that flows right back to boost Malaysia's GNI. Ultimately, GNI is all about who is earning the money.
Now, building right off of that, our next metric is gross domestic product, or GDP. And unlike GNI, GDP is purely about geographical location. It's the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders during 1 year, and it totally ignores who actually owns the businesses. This is exactly why a foreign-owned Intel semiconductor plant, or say a Toyota manufacturing facility operating inside Malaysia, directly boosts Malaysia's GDP. The actual production is happening right there on their soil.
Next up is gross national product, or GNP. Now, GNP shifts the focus entirely back to ownership. It calculates the total value of goods and services produced by a country's citizens and businesses, no matter where on earth that production actually happens. Meaning, if a local company sets up a super lucrative operation halfway across the globe, like our earlier example of Petronas extracting oil overseas, that success shows up in its home country's GNP. But production by a foreign company sitting right inside Malaysia, that wouldn't add a single dime to its GNP.
Comparing these two really perfectly illustrates the crucial distinction between what are probably the two most easily confused metrics out there. Let's break it down simply. GDP really just cares about where the factory is built. It is entirely location-based. GNP, on the flip side, cares about whose name is on the deed. It's completely ownership-based.
Moving right along to Section 2, beyond the surface numbers. It's time to improve our analytics so we can understand a market's true reality. Now, you might look at a country's demographics and think, hey, a huge population automatically means way more customers, right? Well, not exactly. Businesses actually have to evaluate if those consumers have the real purchasing power to sustain long-term growth. Because, let's face it, a massive population is really only a massive market if the people living there can actually afford what you're trying to sell. And that exact problem is where purchasing power parity, or PPP, comes into play. PPP gives us a much more realistic comparison between countries. Why? Because raw market exchange rates just don't tell you how far a dollar actually stretches when you walk into a local grocery store. PPP adjusts the data to reflect the true on-the-ground differences in local living costs. So let's look at how businesses actually apply this in the real world. $100 buys far, far more goods in India than it does in, say, Switzerland, right? The cost of living is just vastly different. And what's really fascinating is that McDonald's actively uses this exact PPP principle. They price their Big Mac much higher in Switzerland than they do in India, specifically to align with that local purchasing power and the reality of what it costs to live there. But wait, there's more. Beyond just purchasing power, we absolutely have to account for the shadow economy. This is a massive, and I mean massive, untaxed and completely unrecorded sector in a lot of developing nations. We're talking about unregistered businesses, cash-only transactions, illegal employment, and unlicensed street vendors. Because all of this trade flies totally under the radar, the official GDP figures can severely, almost shockingly, underestimate the true economic activity going on in a country. All right, Section 3, the rise of green economics. This is where we factor in sustainability. This brings us to a really powerful concept, the triple bottom line, or as it's often called, the three Ps: people, planet, and profit. Modern multinationals are realizing that true sustainability absolutely requires balancing social well-being, environmental protection, and financial success. We see this happening right now with massive household brands. Think about Apple committing to go completely carbon neutral, or Starbucks investing heavily in ethical coffee sourcing. It's proof that taking care of the planet is becoming a core part of the economic equation. And this shift is perfectly captured by the Genuine Progress Indicator, or the GPI. Imagine two places. Country A has a sky-high GDP, but it's plagued by severe pollution, traffic congestion, and crime. Now, Country B has the exact same GDP, but they have clean air, healthy communities, and safe streets. Traditional GDP would look at those two and say, yep, they're exactly equal. But the GPI, it correctly ranks Country B much higher. It literally subtracts the negative impacts, like pollution, and adds in positive contributions like education and volunteer work, proving Country B's citizens are actually enjoying a significantly better quality of life.
Moving right into Section 4, measuring happiness and well-being, or, as I like to call it, the rise of happynomics.
And honestly, no country embodies this better than Bhutan. They literally flipped the entire global economic script by officially declaring that gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product. They decided the holistic well-being of their citizens outranks sheer industrial output. It's such a profound shift, moving from asking how much did we make to asking how well did we live. So how do they actually measure that? Bhutan uses what they call the 4 pillars of gross national happiness. They lock in on sustainable and equitable economic development, environmental conservation, cultural preservation, and good governance. Through really smart policies, like their approach to ecotourism that strictly limits environmental impact, Bhutan essentially proves that you can generate solid, sustainable economic benefits while aggressively protecting your culture and the environment. Finally, Section 5, the investor's final checklist. Let's bring this all back to practical reality and look at the actual economic analysis companies run. 1.4 billion. That is the staggering population of India. But as we learned just a few minutes ago, to a savvy investor, this isn't just a head count. It's all about evaluating a massive potential consumer market. This kind of scale is exactly what draws in companies like Unilever. They meticulously analyze this massive demographic so they can successfully sell affordable, highly diverse product lines to a vast and incredibly varied consumer base. Next up on that final checklist is foreign direct investment, or FDI. This happens when a company from one country actively invests in and controls a business in another country, like building factories or expanding facilities. Just look at Vietnam. Their highly competitive labor costs and really favorable policies have attracted billions in FDI. That's exactly what led Samsung to build massive manufacturing plants there, completely turning the country into a global smartphone export hub. Now, we have to talk about deflation. While continuously cheaper goods might sound absolutely great to you and me when we go shopping, deflation is actually an investor's worst nightmare. It's a continuous decline in the general price level of goods and services over time. For a real-world example, just look at Japan in the 1990s. Consumers expected prices to just keep dropping, so they stopped spending. This forced businesses to slash production and jobs, triggering a deflationary spiral and severe economic stagnation. Believe me, investors watch out for this risk like a hawk. Finally, investors closely analyze income distribution, which is usually measured by something called the Gini coefficient. The takeaway here is simple. A highly unequal society is a highly unstable market. A high Gini index means great income inequality, where wealth is heavily concentrated at the top. And that can lead to poverty, crime, and cripplingly low purchasing power for the everyday consumer. Companies want to invest where wealth is distributed fairly enough to create a broad, capable, and stable consumer base. So, what does this all mean for us? As we've seen on this journey, the true definition of a successful economy has evolved way, way beyond the simple dollar. We've gone from the raw geographic output of GDP to the modern sustainable vision of the triple bottom line, all the way to the profound philosophy of gross national happiness. So it really leaves us with a question to ponder. Looking at the streets outside your own window right now, how does your local economy stack up when we measure success by happiness, health, and sustainability, rather than just the money in the bank? Thanks so much for exploring this with us today.